Okay, let's get right into the message then, because we will get done relatively quickly today then, so I can get you out on your way by noon, and you can go to your favorite restaurant or eating establishment. It might be your home, and get on with your day. But boy, I'm going to feed you today, because I'm going to give you a fair amount of background on one of the events which we have as we see Jesus before Pontius Pilate. I haven't given you much history on Pontius Pilate right now, but obviously he didn't just show up judging Jesus. He's been in Judea for a while, and in that area as the Roman tribune who is in charge of things, and so we want to talk about him today as we talk about this. Now, the first thing I want to do is go to Psalm 2, just a couple verses in Psalm 2, and just be reminded of what that says. It says, "The kings of the earth take a stand, the rulers sit in council together against Yahweh and against his anointed one. Let us break off their shackles and throw their restraints away from us. The one sitting in the heavens laughs. The Lord mocks them." Okay? So they're saying, we're not going to put up with this, what's going on with God, and he laughs. And he mocks them in heaven because of the fact that they are doing only what he allows for his glory. He restrains them at every point. So, the one enthroned in heaven, that's the reference to Psalm 2, accomplishes his plan. That's what we're looking at today as we look at John 18, verse 38, all the way through chapter 19, verse 16. And we're going to be reminded of how Pilate, who did not want to crucify Jesus, was forced into it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Pontius Pilate so you understand what was going on in the background of today's message. There's some important dates that we need to look at as we think about Pontius Pilate. And we also need to know about his mentor, his patron, the guy who was watching over him. Tiberius Caesar semi-retires to Capri in 26 AD. In his place, he appoints Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Okay? Sejanus was, like Tiberius, pretty much an anti-Semite, except that Tiberius didn't show it as much. Sejanus didn't care. He hated the Jewish people, and he appointed someone to Palestine, to Judea, that's what they called it, and he pointed him to Judea and to that whole region who would reflect the anti-Semitism of Sejanus. And Pilate was cruel when he was appointed to this particular position. I entitled it from 26 to 31, a brutal anti-Semitic occupation of Judea. Pilate did everything that he could to just offend them and to create problems. He knew full well, all the Romans knew full well, that if you go to Jerusalem, you don't put up an image. You just don't do that image thing. And what he did is all around the temple, he put up images of Tiberius. And then one day, he called all the Jewish leaders together, and he surrounded them by Roman guards with their swords and spears out. So they were completely surrounded, and he said, "Let me show you what we're doing." And he unveiled all the images. And he said, "If you have a problem with this, you're all going to die." And they all fell to the ground and exposed their necks and said, "Kill us, because we cannot allow this blasphemy to stand." So that unified response stopped him from continuing to go forward in that arena, but he brutally oppressed the people. He did stuff that was awful. I mean, when you talk about, Jesus made one reference to Pilate, the Galileans whose blood Pilate mixed with their sacrifices. Just a brutal man, and earned a well-deserved hatred by the Jewish people because of his brutal oppression of them. Okay, so that was from 26 to 31. In 31, things changed. Sejanus was Tiberius's representative in Rome. Basically, he started running Rome. He was executing, making sure he got rid of all of his rivals, and it became clear that Sejanus was headed to the top, that his goal was to step into the place of Caesar once Tiberius was gone. And he wanted to marry several different people that were connected to the royal line, and that was to give himself that pristine, that look of nobility to him, because he wasn't himself from nobility. And Tiberius, starting to cotton to it, Tiberius's daughter, or sister, I should say, who had never been involved in politics, finally got a message to Tiberius on the island of Capri and said, this is what's going on, and Sejanus is attempting to set himself up as a Caesar. And so Tiberius, who was completely surrounded by Sejanus loyalists, grabbed his one loyal lieutenant. He said, here, take this letter, read it in the Senate. This man was the head of Tiberius's personal guard. When he got there, he told the Praetorian Guard to go to their quarters. They didn't need him because he had his own command with him. And that command completely surrounded the Senate while Sejanus was inside with the senators. And then he read this rambling letter that Sejanus thought was going to be end with him being appointed to a high position in Rome, and it got to the end, and it turned into a scathing rebuke of Sejanus by Tiberius, and call for him to be deposed. He was dead by the end of the day. Okay, that's just the way it is. Now, this is Pilate's friend. This is the guy that appointed Pilate. 31 AD is executed, and then there is a brutal ferreting out of all of Sejanus' supporters, and they would torture them horribly before they killed him. That's how angry Sejanus made people, because he had been torturing and executing so many people in Rome that when it finally flipped, everyone went out. His family was killed. Everyone. They spent time looking for people who had supported Sejanus or had secretly supported Sejanus. And Pilate was really nervous during that time. Now, this was 31 AD. When was Jesus crucified? 33 AD. And so that means Pilate was living honestly on borrowed time. By the way, as part of this response against Sejanus, an edict of toleration went out. Tiberius said, leave the Jews alone. Don't upset them. So he rooted out the Sejanus loyalists from 31 to 34. He issued the decree of toleration. And then in AD 33, you got Jesus before Pilate. AD 36, by the way, Pilate was finally recalled because he did a brutal thing in Samaria, did a brutal oppression up in Samaria, and he was recalled to answer for it. And then Tiberius died on the way, which probably saved his bacon, but he still was exiled. So, that's where we are with Pilate. When you see the next scene set up, remember, Pilate has survived the rout or the purging of Sejanus's supporters. But Sejanus was his patron. They probably let him live because he was doing a job no one wanted. No one in their right mind would want Judea. Okay, it was, pretty nasty. Okay, that's where we pick up today, knowing the historical background. Pilate had just said to Jesus, what is truth? And after he said this, he again went out to the Jewish leaders and said, I find no grounds for an accusation against him. But you have a custom that I release one person to you during the Passover. So do you desire that I release to you the king of the Jews? Then they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a rebel. So Pilate comes out and gives his opinion. I find no grounds for an accusation against him. What Pilate was saying was simply that he broke no Roman laws. There's no reason for us to execute him. And of course, the Jewish leaders wanted him executed by the Romans because the Romans were, they didn't want to take that on themselves. Now, also the prophetic the prophecies of the Old Testament clearly pointed to the fact that he'd be crucified. Jesus himself said he'd be crucified. And remember, the one enthroned in heaven is going to fulfill the words of the Son of God. Okay? And so this was not going to end up in the place that Pilate wanted it to end up. Mostly because Pilate didn't have that integrity of character that would have been needed to stand up for what's right. You know when his integrity of character shows up, or his forcefulness? What I have written, I have written. That's a little bit late. I'm willing to kill the guy, but I ain't changing my post above his cross. You know, okay. So Pilate says, no Roman laws are broken. And he said, however, there's this custom that I have that I can release someone to you. This is just currying favor during Passover from the Jewish people. Remember, an edict of toleration had been passed. And so now he needs to make nice with the Jewish people instead of being as brutal as he was. And he said, I've got this custom now. May have been, by the way, we can't find evidence of it in history. And so it means it was a short-lived custom. It just wasn't long enough that anybody might have been accustomed since Sejanus was executed. The last 2 years we've done this. But he was trying to curry favor, and so he thought, what I'll do is I'll put up this brutal insurrectionist against this man that the crowds of Jerusalem have followed. Which one do you want? And he's assuming the crowds are going to call for Jesus. He didn't understand that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were infiltrating the crowd and saying, you will call for Barabbas. And so he said, do you want me to release the King of the Jews? And Barabbas, the insurrectionist, is who they responded, because the leaders had gone through the crowd and made sure that they called for him. Now, by the way, Barabbas supporters might have been there anyway because they wanted to call for clemency for their guy. Jesus supporters weren't there because no one knew he had been arrested. You remember, it was all done in secret. It was done at night. It was done overnight. So no one knew Jesus was there. His supporters weren't there. The only people that were there were the people that had gone to call for clemency for Barabbas. And now even they would have called for Jesus, except that the high priests and the chief priests went through the crowds. And they made sure that they called for Barabbas. So it says, then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. The soldiers wove a crown from thorny weeds and placed it on his head. They put a purple military cloak around him and began to call to him, greetings, King of the Jews. They also gave him open-handed blows to his face. So this was, part of the process. It's pretty clear that Pilate was trying to stir sympathy for Jesus. It was a normal custom to scourge prisoners before they were executed. Sometimes the scourging was enough to kill the prisoner. And just because of the blood loss, they would use whips with metal embedded in the end. And it would take it right down to the bone on the person's back. And so the blood loss could be incredible. It's one of the reasons Jesus couldn't carry his crossbeam all the way out. I mean, he'd been so weakened by the blood loss after this scourging and the way that he had been treated. More than likely, he was not given any water during this time. We can't even begin to imagine the fever that would have caused, along with everything else. So Pilate tries to extricate himself from it. He's going to try to get sympathy for Jesus. And that doesn't work, but he's trying. He's still trying to get himself out of it. The soldiers play along with the whole King of the Jews thing. They grab one of their military robes. You ever see the pictures of the Romans? They were always, the officers were always wearing those purple military robes or red military robes. So they began to call to him. They made a crown from thorny weeds, and that, of course, the crown of thorns is the way it is normally referred to. And they said, greeting, King of the Jews. They thought, yeah, this is the King of the Jews. Right. They had heard what the charges were and what was being said, and so that they're having a pretty grand time of it. And then they also began to slap him. That was, they pretend to bow down, and they gave him open-handed slaps across the face. It says that they also beat him on the head. Well, now you're wearing a crowny thorn. thing, and then they beat that into your head. That had to feel wonderful. So now they give him back to Pilate, and Pilate again came out and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you might know that I find no grounds of charge against him." Then Jesus came outside wearing the crown made of thorns and the purple cloak. And Pilate said to them, "Look at the man." Then when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they shouted out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." So Pilate is saying again, he didn't break any Roman laws, but look, because of the fact that you're ticked off at him, look what I've had happen to him. And he says, "Look at the man," not the king. The soldiers had said king. He said, "Look at the man." And I suspect what Pilate was attempting to do was to stir their sympathy for one of their own. Look what the Romans, the hated Romans, did to him because he's a Jew. But their hatred for him was so huge. Even that was not enough to stir sympathy toward him. And they cried out again and again, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said, "You take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no grounds for the charge against him." The Jewish leaders answered him, "We have our own law, and according to the law he deserves to die, for he made himself the Son of God." So they're saying he does deserve to die, and we're not going to be the ones who execute him. That's your job. He claimed to be the Son of God. And the religious leaders show their cards to Pilate, finally. They're saying, we need him killed because he claimed to be deity. And so they're just coming right out before Pilate and saying, we need him to die because he claimed to be God. And then it says, when Pilate heard this report, he was even more afraid. And he went into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give an answer to him. So Pilate said to him, "Why aren't you speaking to me? Don't you know that I have authority to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus responded to him, "You would not have any authority over me except it was given to you from above. On account of this, the one who handed me over to you has committed a greater sin. The one enthroned in heaven is the one who has given you the authority," is what Jesus was saying. And he was in charge because from the foundations of the world, Jesus was the Lamb of God who was crucified for the sins of the world. This sacrifice was going to take place. Pilate is even more afraid. Okay? Now think about that. Pilate is even more afraid. He already was afraid. He was dealing with this explosive situation. He knew how tenuous his hold was on his position and how easy it would have been to earn the disfavor of Tiberius. He was afraid of that. He certainly was a man who wanted to uphold Roman law. That was a part of what was drilled into him. And so he didn't want to violate Roman law. Executing Jesus for no reason was not the Roman way. And so he was dealing with it, but now all of a sudden he hears this guy claims to be the Son of God, and they're so threatened, the Jewish leaders are so threatened by it, that they want him dead. Now, by the way, you all know about the Roman superstitions and their religion. Gods and demigods were everywhere. Hercules, all those sons of God by illicit relationships. I mean, it would be like, oh my goodness, is this really one of them? Because Pilate had certainly heard about the miraculous reports that had come from Jesus. Herod heard about it. By the way, the book of John doesn't focus much on Herod at all in the whole trial thing. But remember, from the other Gospels, we know that Pilate he tried to get rid of the responsibility by sending him to Herod. He said, oh, he's a Galilean. Well, then send him to Herod. And Herod was in town, just down the street. So that didn't take up hardly any time at all. He got an interview before Herod. Herod said, "You're boring me." Sent him back to Pilate. And it said that they became fast friends that day, united by this common problem. So Pilate was even more afraid. He runs back in and he says, "Where are you from?" And Jesus isn't answering him. Now remember, there's also his wife's dream. And that, this is His wife sends him a note. While he was sitting upon his judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him and said, "Let nothing transpire between you and that righteous man, for today I have suffered much in a dream about him." And that is, you can imagine. Here he is sitting there. He hates it. He hates it that he has to be involved in this thing. And then he gets a note from his wife, and he's like, she's always the one that hears. I mean, you understand. He's like going, oh, crumb. But it doesn't matter. He can't. He is being forced into a corner, and he's saying, Jesus, talk to me. Don't you know I have authority to free you or to crucify you? And that was a false assumption. That's his false assumption. He thinks he's still in control. He is not in control. Jesus was going to give his life for the sins of the world. It doesn't absolve Pilate because Pilate still had to cave out of cowardice to the Jewish people. And so, but Pilate had a false assumption. It's in the same way that Judas isn't absolved, even though what he did was exactly what needed to be done so that Jesus would be handed over to his enemies. Judas is totally responsible for it, and yet in God's planning, he had worked it in so that our sins would be paid for. So Jesus says, no, the guys that handed you over have a greater sin than you do, which I'm not sure Pilate was very encouraged by. From this time, Pilate sought to free him, but the Jewish leaders shouted out, saying, "If you free this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself a king is speaking against Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, which in the Hebrew dialect is Gabbatha. It was about the 6th hour on the Passover day of preparation. And this was, by the way, when they said you're not a friend of Caesar, that's a technical term. This was checkmate. Because Sejanus had been an amicus Caesaris. He had been one of the friends of Caesar. And that was revoked from him. Many of the people that he had appointed were known as friends of Caesar, and obviously they had all ended up dead. Those titles revoked from them. And now the chief priest, knowing very well the threat to Pilate, goes, "You're not," technical term, "a friend of Caesar if you let him go." And that means they were going to send evidence to Rome that this man was no longer a friend of Caesar because he let a rival king survive. And that was checkmate. It was over right then because Pilate couldn't possibly survive that. And so he understood. He sat on the stone pavement. He prepared for judgment. Right at the time that the Passover lamb was being presented, examined, and Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Behold your king." Therefore those leaders cried out, "Do away with him! Do away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate responded to them, "I should crucify your king?" The chief priest countered, "We have no king except Caesar." Then he handed Jesus over to them in order that he might be crucified. Pilate, once again, he sits on the judgment seat. He knows what he's about to do. Remember, he also did the washing of his hands thing? He said, and he said, "I'm clean of this man's blood." As if making the wrong judgment out of fear, you can somehow exonerate yourself by washing your hands. That's ludicrous. But that's the human nature, isn't it? And when you ask people about whether they deserve to go to heaven when they die, often if they don't know the Lord, sometimes if they do, because they get a little, they haven't quite learned about the difference between works and grace, but they often will make statements like, "Well, yeah, I deserve to be in heaven because I've done more good than bad." And that's kind of Pilate's idea. He says, you know what? By washing my hands, this external action is going to absolve me of this evil action. And maybe he literally thought, what I'll do is I'll do really good stuff from here on in to make sure that I do more good stuff than bad stuff in my judicial positions. But it doesn't absolve anything. There's only one way to find forgiveness. As far as we know, Pilate never surrendered himself to the Lord. That doesn't mean he didn't. I just said as far as we know. So wouldn't that be a kicker to find Pilate in heaven? Okay, that'd be like, whoa, man, I never expected to see you here. And Pilate, who had been part of the great cloud of witnesses for 2,000 years, would look at us and say, there were times I didn't think you'd be here either. It's by grace that you are saved through faith. So we can never be surprised by who shows up in the heavenly realms. We rejoice. And by the way, when we show up there or when Jesus comes again and we meet the returning hosts, we will be delighted by everyone that we thought wasn't there, who in their last moments turned their hearts over to Jesus Christ. So anyway, so he says, behold your king. And those leaders cried out. He just gave him one more chance. He knows he's toast right now. And they are shouting, do away with him, do away with him, crucify him. And Pilate's probably now, he's like, I should crucify your king? He's just, by this point, he's worn down. And they said, we have no king except Caesar. Can you imagine the Jewish leaders saying this? They hated Rome. They hated Caesar. They were all, in fact, by 70 AD, in the late 60s actually, there's going to be full insurrection against Rome there because they hated Caesar so much. And yet here, in order to get rid of Jesus, they make this ludicrous claim and put themselves under the authority of Rome, which Rome within 40 years would exercise fully and destroy the city. Because the king that you are under has authority over you. And they gave that king license that day in a public tribunal. That's amazing. So Pilate says we just get more testimony from him. The Sadducees get there, say, as leaders of the people of Israel spiritually, and they say, no, we're under Rome. We don't want this guy. And it didn't end up real well for them. And Pilate at that point in time is totally defeated. The theme for today is the one who is throned in heaven laughs. There is a lot of distressing stuff that's happening on the world scene right now. I think I've told you this. When I was with Chris in Germany, Chris Reed, I asked him, I said, Chris, is there a chance we're in the tribulation? What do you think? And his response was, what do you think? That's, by the way, how you get out of answering a question. You throw it back. And by the way, I did not say, no, I'm asking you, what do you think? Okay, because, then it's a game, and he's actually the leader of the ministry, so I lose that game. I'm just saying. Okay. So I just said, jury's out. But the reason I bring that up to you today is simply because of the fact that if we are anywhere near the tribulation, we're in the last days, and the Bible says some very clear things about the last days. Tom Hardiman at the early service last week at MorningStar Ministries talked about the fact that we're clearly in the last days and what we can expect. And if you look at Old Testament prophecies and New Testament prophecies, it's pretty clear that things start to get dicey. When I prayed earlier about the dome over Florida, I was serious. I believe that God's going to grant special protection to the people of Florida because of the grace that he has released here and the way that the people of Florida have responded. I believe that. But if I'm wrong, we still have God's grace and protection. Rick Joyner had a dream vision once in which he was standing on the, I believe it was an aircraft carrier, because I think that was where he was in the Navy. He was on an aircraft carrier. So he was standing in the control area of an aircraft carrier, radar's going, and right ahead of the ship, there is suddenly something on collision course. And so he gives the command, starboard. I almost went starboard the wrong way. Starboard. Port, he's just changing directions as quickly as possible. But no matter which direction he went, it stayed right in front of him. And so he finally had to call, brace for impact. That's never a good day on a ship. Brace for impact. And so they all brace themselves. Do they have seatbelts on carriers? Starship Enterprise never did. You ever think about that? Okay, anyway. Brace for impact. And so they brace themselves and they hit it, but there's nothing. The ship doesn't even jar. They hit it, but they go right through it. And Jesus was suddenly standing there, and Rick looks at him and goes, "What was that?" And he says, "That was the Great Tribulation." All those who are connected to Jesus don't have to be afraid of it. Okay, now that's pretty powerful. And that's why Jesus said, when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is a double fulfillment prophecy pretty clearly in Matthew 24, about the time that was going to happen at the end of the Jewish age and then the time which is going to happen at the end of the Gentile age, that he said, "Lift up your head, your redemption is drawing near." This is a time of excitement for God's people. So the worst thing that we could do is get involved in fear when we see bad things happening. We are going to see nuclear explosions over cities. Okay, that's going to happen. When that happens, the world is going to be filled with fear. You have a choice at that particular point in time. Will you cower in fear with the world, or will you lift up your head, for your redemption is drawing near? Okay, that will happen. That may happen on U.S. soil. I pray it doesn't. But if that happens on U.S. soil, we have to stand as witnesses to Jesus Christ with courage and boldness. And the Romans 8 passage, which we are all familiar with. We're familiar with it in the translation that says all things work together for the good of those who love God. Better translated, God works with those who love him so that all things turn out good. And you can see that in the footnote of the NIV. If I ever do get my Bible translation published, I'm editing it right now. And by editing is a lot harder work than you think. Okay. But it will have that version on top and the old version in the footnote, because I think it's pretty clear that it needs to be translated that way. God works with those who love him so that all things work out for good. And the reason is simply this, is because God wants to really, number one, the grammar says that, but God works with his people. I mean, you think about Katrina and what an awful thing that was for the southern Gulf Coast. But you know how many of God's people mobilized and made sure that people were met and comforted by God, and their needs were met, and things were released, because God's people were there, along with a whole bunch of other people, but God's people were there doing everything they could, so that people's lives were protected, comfort was brought to them, restoration was brought to them, and then Jesus Christ was glorified through them. That's good, okay? Being able to help people who have gone through a bad circumstance. And so when we see the type of things that we believe will be coming upon the earth in these days, and I mean the type of attacks that we have seen in Israel on October 7th are coming to the shores of the United States. The southern border has sealed that. It is baked in, whatever the expression is, cake, whatever. It's baked in the cake, in the plant, whatever. It's going to happen. We've been warned that by the head of the FBI. We've been warned that. The United States of America, citizens have been told, expect this type of attack to happen on our soil. You can get into fear at that particular point in time, or you can step forward and lift up your head, for your redemption is drawing nigh. The one enthroned in heaven laughs because he's in control. And he's covering his people. And, if there's one thing that the land of Goshen shows us, you remember Israel lived in Goshen at the time of Pharaoh when he was persecuting them. And God sent 10 plagues. And the first plagues also impacted Goshen. Let me see. When's the last plague we've had? I wonder when that was. The first plagues impacted Goshen, but at a certain point there was a line of demarcation. The people of God were no longer impacted. So, I'm just saying, if that's the way he worked with the people of Israel in Goshen, I think we should expect something like that with his people here. And we have biblical evidence for that when it says in Isaiah 60, arise, shine, for your light is come. And it says the glory of God's going to appear upon you. Part of the glory of God is the differentiation that God is going to release between his people and the people who are not his people. The one enthroned in heaven will laugh, and we do not need in any way to be filled with fear over the days in which we live. Jesus didn't even respond to Pilate on his own behalf. It's like every time he reached out, it was so that Pilate would be ministered to. And as we are doing the job that God has called us to do in the world in which we live today and in our region, we have to be thinking of the people around us. Now, that doesn't mean we don't prepare. That doesn't mean that we are not, doing what we think is wisdom and necessary. But it does mean that we never give in to fear. And we trust that whatever it is, however it is that we can prepare, God can multiply all of that. Okay, we don't shirk our responsibilities. If God is giving us insight and wisdom on how to prepare, you do it. But at the same time, if God doesn't multiply the loaves and the fish, it's not going to work anyway. We have a promise. God's going to multiply the loaves and the fish. And he's going to smile through the entire thing. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this day on which we are able to pull back what was going on in history, but more than that, pulling back what's going on in the heavenly realms as people attempt to cancel your purposes on the earth. I know, Lord, even today, as Klaus Schwab is trying to do his best to foment trouble around the world, as those like him are involved in releasing wickedness around the world. Lord, I know that you are in heaven laughing at them. All of the world leaders who think that they somehow are able to stop the advance of the gospel in your kingdom, Lord, you're laughing at them because they have no ability to do so. And so today, as we come before you, I ask that you would help us lift up our heads and rejoice, because our redemption is drawing nigh. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.